everyone, and welcome to this headlining evening slot this evening from my rather chilly shed in Wiltshire in southwest England. During this next hour, we're going to be learning about forage crops and grazing approaches that are enabling farming systems to be more resilient to climate change, as well as optimising livestock growth and positive health from forage. Who knows what this year will bring us, but in the UK last year, we had one of the driest springs on record yet again, and this autumn and winter we've been faced with prolonged periods of flooding, and these sorts of extremes in weather and climate are mirrored all across the world. So if we want to maintain pasture-based systems, which are clearly the most sustainable and economically viable, then we really need to think about how we adapt the systems that we have by growing more resilient forage crops and also focusing on nurturing the soil. So we've got three excellent speakers this evening who are going to share some of their experiences. David and George, who both farm in the UK, and then also we're joined by John King from New Zealand, which is one of the reasons we've got this premier evening slot, which is really exciting, as New Zealand is slightly ahead on this learning curve, really, with sort of resilient forage crops, and a lot of the learning that some of the farmers are practicing in the UK is stuff that they're bringing home from New Zealand. So it's going to be really interesting to hear the journeys that some of the farmers that he's been working with have been on. Also, I'm Kate, and I'm part of the farming team at the Soil Association, which I'm imagining some of you will have heard about us. But for those who aren't aware, we're a charity focusing on transforming the way that we eat, farm, and care for our natural world. And we're actively working with all farmers and policymakers to achieve regeneration and build a world with good health in balance with nature and a safe climate. And we have our own organic certification standards and scheme, and we're working to support organic farmers at all times. So the way that we'll run the session this evening is, after just a few more brief words from me, David is going to tell us about his experience, and then George, and then John. And we'll take a few questions between each of the speakers, and then some more broader questions towards the end. Because we've got this special late night slot, we can't have the extra Zoom room, but if there's lots of discussion that we want to carry on with, then we've got an opportunity to book a meeting room on another day, probably Wednesday. So we'll follow up with that if we feel like there's still lots of need for you to be able to talk to our speakers. So we were keen to bring you this session tonight as part of our Fabulous Farmers programme. And this programme is about encouraging farmers to take up specific practices that increase the functional agrobiodiversity on their farm, or FAB as it's shortened to. And FAB refers to elements of biodiversity that provide ecosystem services supporting sustainable agricultural production, while also delivering benefits to the environment and society as a whole. And this FAB project is really about delivering ecosystem services, reducing inputs, but then also supporting economic and sustainable farming. And the economic bit is really key on demonstrating that these agroecological FAB practices, can save you money as well as deliver a huge amount for biodiversity. So you'll see on this slide here that there's a series of measures that are being encouraged through the FAB programme. And one of those, and one that the Soil Association is focusing on really, is herbal and diverse leys. These leys have been identified as having, a wealth of benefits between sort of soil health, but then building soil fertility through the legumes that you have in these mixes, and allowing you to reduce inputs. Also, these mixes, have been demonstrating sort of real resilience to extremes in weather, or extremes in rainfall, I should say. And the deep rooting nature of many of these species enable them to extract moisture from deep down in the soil. And they're able to put on really quite rapid growth. And then many of these species also are proving to be sort of very resilient in periods of high rainfall, partly because of their sort of improvement in soil structure and improving infiltration. So you've got sort of a double benefit of both the tolerance to drought, but then being able to manage and still grow well in periods of wet weather. So farmers are generally finding that, the ryegrass leys that they have been so dependent on are just really not coping with these periods of really dry weather and are burning up, largely due to their very shallow rooting depth. And it's the herbal leys and deep rooting species that are really becoming their go-to paddocks in this dry weather. So if you'd like to learn more about any of the fab work, particularly the stuff that we're doing on herbal leys, and if you're a farmer farming in the southwest of England or in Wales and would be interested to be part of one of our learning networks, then do please get in touch with me, and I'm sure my colleague hopefully will put my contact details a bit at the end, and we can get you as part of the network. But moving straight on, so we're going to hear from David first and about his journey. So David is a sheep and arable farmer in northwest Norfolk, I should say, and he runs a flock of New Zealand composite ewes, which he lambs outdoors. He's previously worked in America and New Zealand on dryland beef and sheep farms, and his focus is on proving quality and consistency of summer forage supply. David's running an innovative farmers trial for us on extended grazing of lucerne with ewes and lambs. And the Innovative Farmers Network is this farmer-led research network that supports farmers to do research that delivers the answers that they're looking for. So trials that, are important to them. So I'll pass over to David now and hear what he's been up to. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kate. Hi, everybody. I'll give you a little overview of let me just open up my screen there. Yeah, a little overview of our farm. So, as Kate said, we're northwest Norfolk, we're about 1,000 acres, and we're tenants. I'm 5th generation on the farm. We also rent a couple hundred acres of grass on top. Yeah, around 900 ewes we lamb. We also sublet about 140 acres to a free-range pig unit where we finish about 4,500 pigs every 6 months. A little bit of irrigated potatoes on the flatter, lighter land at the top of the farm. Sugar beet, spring and winter barley, bit of wheat, and we grow a small amount of fodder beet, which is just either lifted and fed as a contingency to the ewes or sold. And then the rest is grazing mixes. So historically, we've been sort of perennial ryegrass, white clover, chicory, plantain, sort of moving away from that. So I'll go back to the beginning. 3 years ago, we were given the opportunity by Easy Rams to be a multiplier flock. So they are, if you don't know them, they are a terminal ram breeder. They would say dual purpose, I suppose. They wanted to start breeding composite maternals. So they've imported some Grey rams from New Zealand and some Tefrons. So we take their rams, we put them across what was our New Zealand Romneys cross New Zealand Texels. We then select a sort of, I don't know, top 25%. They buy them back, CT scan them, various things, riddle those through, and then sell those rams. So it was an opportunity for us to start moving away from just commodity lamb. So we sell probably 2/3 of our top lambs as just dead weight lambs to Randall Parker. The remaining third to Easy Rams, and then breeding females. So we remove quite a lot of risk there. Just trying to follow my notes. The sort of long-term plan for the farm as a mixed farm is to phase out sugar beet, try and reduce the amount of tillage that we do. And one of the benefits of the outdoor pig system is we have about 16,000 tons of muck. And ordinarily that goes into the sugar beet. reduces our nitrogen input in that, but there's a lot of tillage involved in that. We plough. There is options to reduce that, but yeah. So the plan would be to establish our forage leys and our cover crops with pig muck and phase out wheat. So we'll move on. So with trying to ramp up our output, the Easy Rams opportunity sort of gave me a kick up the backside to try and move things along. So coming back from New Zealand and moving back home, I realised that we were quite a long way behind. We had higher rainfall than where I was. We had poorer growth rates, much more inconsistent forage through the summer when it mattered. So I figured we needed to try and do something about it. So I actually went back just for a 2-week trip, visited around some farms, twigged onto lucerne that we needed to, mainly from the aviaries. There's a lot of information online about what Doug has done with his farm. So we planted some lucerne. We got involved with Innovative Farmers, which is some funding, which meant I could get some consultancy help and just walked through some of it. So we drilled our lucerne in the autumn of 19. Not ideal. It's better spring sown. The classes of stock we struggled with growth was growing out our twin-born ewe lambs and our triplet-born lambs of our normal ewes. So we put all our ewe lambs on the lucerne. So we set stock 10 days pre-lambing. As you can see here, they go in at about sort of 15 centimeters high. It's quite the target for us is we want plus 300 grams across the board. So we're trying to come up with specialist systems to get that out of each class of stock. It's quite easy to get it out of a mature ewe with a single. It'd be a waste putting them on this lucerne, because pretty much whatever, from what I have seen, whatever class of stock you buy, you pretty much get sort of 300 plus grams a day out of your lambs. But the real advantage is that you wean ewes in much better body condition. So there's no real point in putting a single on lucerne when you can get 300 grams a day and decent growth, 300 grams a day and decent body condition out of your ewes on pretty much anything for the single. So we targeted this for the twin-born ewe lambs. Let's go to the next slide. This was the basic trial, little field. We chose this field because it had a background of grass. 6 paddocks. We set stock to start with. We rattle our ewes during lambing into single week groups. To get the numbers right, I put 3 groups, so 21 days worth of lambing. Also not ideal. If we had more lucerne, I could target it better, because you want the least period of time where it's set stock. You want to get it into a rotation. So this was so I left the grass paddocks open, so they had a background of grass. And then as soon as about a week after lambing had finished, we got them into this rotation. The target being 30 centimeters to move into, and moving out when they were having to start to eat lignified stalk. So the leaf, if I can remember this right, just pure leaf of lucerne is 22% plus protein and 12 ME plus, but the stem is about 12 protein and 8 ME. it's about striking a balance from utilization and trying to keep consistent feed and not getting the ewes too hungry so they don't gorge when you move them through. So we can move on. I'm probably missing all sorts, so just ask questions as we go. I've got a little video here just to show you the residual and then the ewes moving through into the next paddock. I don't think the sound will work, but so just park the bike down the fence so they don't bust over the fence, walk down, put your foot on the wire, and they just move themselves. These lambs are about 6 weeks old, no, about a month now. They are in a for this trial, they're in a rotation for 100 days. We started to get some problems with them being on for such a long period of time. So I think I would probably wean around 70 days now, get the period of time shorter. But yeah, you can see that. So the balance is you can't get them too hungry so they don't come and gorge. One of the problems with the lambs is that they really don't need to eat that much. So their rumen doesn't fully develop. They keep quite a small rumen. So you can get, if they're going from empty to full frequently, you can get things like twisted gut. So we had down the central spine of the field, if you remember the previous slide two ago, we've got a water main, and then we've got these, you just push a pipe in the top, remaining live, and your trough, which we have got here, which we knocked up. It's got a trough on a sled, hook it behind the bike. So you need to feed them roughage all the time. And they do self-regulate, actually. When you move them first in, you wouldn't think that they would eat any roughage, but they actually do. And then they eat less roughage as there's more available as the stem content of the diet goes up. So when they first go into the system, we were doing roughly a 3-day rotation. At the beginning, you can be quite flexible and have quite a tight rotation. Well, you have to really, because it's growing so fast. But with lucerne, it needs the autumn rest. So we started on a 3-day, 7 paddocks, it was 21 days. And basically it worked out that each rotation we extended by a day. So one full circle, then 4 days, another full circle, then 5 days. And that coincided with weaning, and we had given the lucerne a reasonable break. So this is so these are all twin-bearing lambs out of ewe lambs, which I'm pretty pleased with these. Most of them, we probably need to be slightly more flexible on the carcass weight, and send these guys away at a smaller carcass weight. So we struggled. I put these lambs back onto the lucerne, and our consistency of growth was great. I'll go on to the next slide. 2 slides away. The consistency of growth as we put them back on was very poor. Had some lambs continuing to do sort of 400 grams, some that were right down at 300. And I think we put that down to, we had poor sunlight hours later in the season. I think the nitrogen content of the leaf was too high, and we were getting photosensitivity in the lambs. So the approach for next year is we're taking some of the residual pig ground, and we're going to put some targeted cover crops in for weaning our lambs onto, so we can give them a rest. One of the problems with weaning the lambs off the lucerne, their rumen being smaller, you need to maintain quality forage because their rumen smaller. It will, you for want of a better word, it does stretch to accommodate more feed, but for that sort of couple of week period from weaning, if you put them onto a poorer diet, they'll go backwards. So it's quite a difficult thing to balance. As the system gets further on and we've got more lucerne, we'll be able to hopefully drop blocks out, conserve it, sell it, do what we want, maybe have another enterprise going on. But yeah, so these are the ewe lambs pre-weaning, post-weaning. Sorry, great body condition, 3.5s, which is the highest we've weaned anything.
Hey David, 2 to 3 minute warning.
Yeah, no problem. I'll rattle through. So this is a comparison: mixed age ewes versus the ewe lambs. Mixed age ewes 297 grams, and the ewe lambs 295. Pretty amazing, considering the class of stock. Weaned to whole condition score higher. Ewes lost 10 kilos. Ewe lambs pre-lambing were 52 kilos, so they gained 11 during their lambing and lactation period. The figures at the bottom there are slightly wrong. It was 820 kilos per hectare that we weaned on the ewe lambs. Most of that's down to the ewe gain and to the stocking rate. We're roughly, 14 ewes to the hectare, whereas the grass and clover was 3.5. Yeah, so this little video just shows some water damage, and lucerne really does not like wet roots. And we've got some springs that popped up late winter in this field, but I can show you here, which is also another problem. I'll skip through. This is that same patch about 6 weeks later. So then we had a problem the other way, that we just couldn't keep on top of the growth with it being such a small trial. We couldn't really go in and mow and conserve half-hectare blocks. So yeah, there's room for improvement. With lucerne, you basically, at 30 centimeters, you basically have 3 ton of dry matter available. As it gets taller, you maintain the dry matter that's available, but you have a higher residual. So you just get poor utilization. They're just wasted growing days. You can see it's pretty impressive. So going forward, we've entered into a new environmental scheme. We've put 150 acres of the farm into GS4 herbal leys. This is one that we drilled in the autumn after some winter barley. It's I think 16, 17 mixed species stuff in there. So with this, it gives us the flexibility because it's subsidised. The stewardship, we can justify having a slightly lower stocking rate, which removes the risk. There's a wide variety of plants in there, different root depths. We're doing a little trial on this with sort of 2 different grazing managements, some with sort of samphire lucerne type mix, and one with a sort of red clover, faster rotation type of mix. This was a ley that we were trying to get into a carbon footprint trial. So we're going to do a comparison across all of the various different forages. We've still got some white clover and perennial ryegrass in, so it'll be interesting to try and benchmark across all 3. Yeah, pretty picture of some sheep, and the link to the side. Anybody wants to know anything about lucerne, go there, and it's got pretty much everything. Conscious of my time running out, so that's me. I've probably scooted over an awful lot of stuff.
Great. No, that's amazing. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, sorry, it's such a very short amount of time, but you managed to cover lots of ground. Thank you. There's some questions. I will just take a couple quick ones now. What's your annual rainfall, your farm?
We're about between 26 and 30 inches. Very summer dry. Most of it comes in the winter. Especially this last year, we're actually 4 inches above our average annual rainfall list for 2020, but we had a third for May to July of our normal rainfall.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Sure. So it's the fact that it's all coming down one end. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's all at the point at which you need it. It was when we don't get it.
Yes. Yes. Sure. Just the type of lucerne, the variety that is it a particular grazing variety that you're using?
So the trial was Lozelle, which has got a lower growing point, or supposedly. Guys I talked to in New Zealand say, don't worry about the variety, go on a mid-winter dormancy. So going off that, we've now drilled a small field of mid-winter dormancy, highest yielding cutting mix as a comparison. I think it probably won't be quite as persistent, but we'll find out.
Okay, real. There's some bits of questions about mixes, but I think we'll come back when we talk to some of the other guys about that. Just very quick about managing it and being able to, do you need to top off the stalks once they've come out, or are they, if you've got enough leafy growth that it just comes back through?
So as we go forward, and I see it sort of taking up about 20% of our grazing area, so all of our triplets and all of our ewe lambs and lamb on it. We would probably pre-mow before grazing, or pre-mow at least a proportion, so that would tidy up the residual. But the residual is just aesthetic. It starts again from the base. Depends how pretty you like it to be.
You want it, sure. Yeah.
The stalks are still out there, but they're slowly dying down and getting eaten by worms and things. So yeah, it makes a great winter cover for protecting the soil.
Protecting your soil, yeah. Similarly to like a chicory stalk type thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
We've got there's people have been asking for your slides. Would you be able to share some of your slides afterwards?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you ever so much. We'll come back. We've got some more discussions at the end, but we'll shoot on now to George Young. So George, bless him, is talking at a number of sessions across the conference, but he's very kindly also joining us this evening. He's one of our farming ambassadors, so bless him, he's joining us. So he's a agroecological farmer from Fobbing Farm in Essex, and is really working to try and create a genuinely biodiverse farming system, producing as diverse range of nutrition and fibre as possible, as well as plenty of interconnected areas for nature to breathe and play its part in our beautiful world. So he's going to tell us a bit about how he's been introducing herbal leys into his arable system and general farming system. Thank you very much, George.
Lovely. Thanks very much for that, Kate. Good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for tuning in at this hour. I am George Young, aka Farming George, and you can find me on that handle on all of the social medias. I farm in South Essex in the UK, having moved home about 8 years ago. Previously, I worked in London as a banker, so I moved from one vilified career to another one. Fantastic. And my farm has transformed a lot in the past 8 years. So when I moved home, we were really conventional, growing wheat, rape and peas, occasionally linseed and barley, and we also had cattle, but only store animals, and we kept them on the rough grazing, and they had nothing to do with the rest of our farming system. In my 8 years of farming, we've been dealing with some really severe weather as well. Our base rainfall, which is around about 590 mil, hasn't really shifted, but we're now experiencing all of our rain at one time, kind of like David just said, and then all of our dry at another. Now, the picture on the left is a couple of years ago, me being able to put my arm in cracks all the way up to the elbow, some even more than that. And then the picture in the middle and on the right is me attempting to establish winter crops this year. And I managed about 30% of what I wanted to get in. So not especially fantastic, to be perfectly honest. Now, with wet winters being so common, one of the first things I changed was to diversify my combinable cropping. So buckwheat and lentils were the first things to come. Both of those were fine to be established late in the spring, and hemp followed a year or two later. But the markets for these crops, trust me, are really tricky. But also, it's all very well establishing these crops late, but ironically, last year we went from it being too wet to too dry in the space of about a fortnight. And so those spring crops were constantly a little bit of a struggle. I've also begun growing heritage wheat varieties. The top left here is something called Percival's Blue Cone. It looks absolutely stonking at harvest and has the most magnificent name in the business. And the bottom right was my attempt at growing Khorasan, which people may have heard of, otherwise called Kamet, very, very unsuccessfully. So the idea with these heritage crops is the fact that they root so much deeper, and should therefore be able to survive droughts better. But the thing is, I like to analyse two things when I'm implementing new crops on the farm. What is agronomically beneficial? So this is where kind of planting dates and harvest dates come in, and also whether kind of crops are able to nutrient mine at all. Plus also kind of what do we need as humans? So hemp is a really fantastic example of a dual purpose crop with an amazing fiber and a really nutritious seed with tons of omega-3s, 6s and 9s. And I'm also actually doing a similar trial this year with a girl called Rosie. She's going to be making some linens from some flax that I'm going to grow, so actual flax, not linseed. And hopefully I'm going to take the seed as well, so we'll have a proper dual purpose crop there. Now, besides those 2 points, I just want to take a second to explain agroecology, which I'm sure is a term a lot of people have heard of recently, but it's the most important thing in forming how I farm, and I'm not sure people fully understand what it means. So it can essentially be split into 3 simple points. Number 1, farming with nature. Number 2, circular farming, which is essentially whereby any waste products are retained on the farm, converted into secondary products, and then utilised on the farm. And the third point is engaging the local community in the farm with special focus on food sovereignty. So the top 2 pictures here are my flour mill, which should hopefully be up and running pretty imminently. And from a circular farming perspective, this is really important. It keeps my grain on the farm, and by milling it here, the waste grain, which is cleaned out prior to milling, can then be used for livestock feed. And I'm going to caveat that as saying monogastric livestock feed ain't going anywhere near my ruminants. And of course, the bran from the milling can also be composted or go through those same livestock. And of course, this is a super powerful connection when it comes to my local community. They're going to get to bake with my flour whilst overlooking my fields of wheat growing, which is just kind of amazing. So anyway, on to the topic in hand. Focusing on those first 2 points with regards to agroecology, which are obviously farming related, this is why I've introduced herbal leys. As I said earlier, we're dealing with really, really tricky weather spikes, and my land isn't in the best condition any longer. Trust me, trying to farm your way out of trouble with annual combinable crops is just not possible, or not for a farmer with as little skill as me. So herbal leys are an amazing cure. The difference they make to soil in a really short time is pretty stupendous, with all kinds of varying rooting depths, working synergistically to restructure the soil and enabling natural drainage and water holding capacity. And you can see this in a really, really short period of time. So when farms are so used to annual crops, the ecological boost that can occur by chucking in 20-something species of grasses, legumes, broadleaves and herbs is astonishing. And just look at the gorgeous sight you get to behold. I'm a little bit of a sucker for pretty flowers, and these 5 especially are some of my favourites. You've got sandfoin, yarrow, crimson clover, birdfoot trefoil and Persian clover. And these 2 clovers are actually annuals, but I love the flowers so much that they have to make it into my mix. And what's really cool is some of these flowers are even surviving into January now, which is a huge benefit from an ecological basis. Now, with these herbal leys being part of my farming rotation, I really thought I'd better step up my grazing gain from the store cattle which we had previously, which has resulted in this pretty gorgeous herd of red poles that I bought at the end of last year. Polled, which obviously means that I can safely grab cow selfies without worrying about horns. And red poles ended up being the no-brainer choice for me. Heritage, local and dual purpose, so for beef and for dairy. And the dairy is something I'm really focusing on this year to hopefully implement a calf at foot system next year. And if you're going grass-fed, calf at foot and raw milk, those are going to be 3 smashing points for cheese. So these were all due to calve from the start of March. So it was a little bit of a surprise when a new edition turned up at the end of December. This is Iris, and thankfully she's doing very well despite the freezing temperatures and wet weather. And I got to say, it feels absolutely incredible to welcome new life onto the farm. And this is the first time in about 50 years here in Fobbing. Now, I know every single livestock farmer knows exactly what I'm talking about, but to the 100% arable chaps, trust me, you're missing out. Now, growing herbal leys and topping them is obviously something you could do, but those leys are still going to be a massive benefit of the arable rotation like that. But I don't think the benefit of ruminant livestock, such as cows or sheep, can be understated. Obviously, mowing can't be particularly fantastic for the other wildlife that use a diverse ley as their habitat anyway, but also why wear metal and burn diesel when something beautiful and natural will do it for you? Now, that being said, I have made haylage of these herbal leys, and all I'd recommend is make sure you take that chicory out of the mix, because it makes some really, really skanky bales of haylage. Now, one of the really useful things, obviously, about having a closed herd is being able to control their worming status. Synthetic wormers are really persistent in livestock and have some pretty dire consequences to biodiversity. With good management, the prophylactic use of wormers should be really quite unnecessary on the whole, and by utilising mob grazing, as well as the natural anthelmintic properties of certain plants like sainfoin and trefoil, of course, along with annual egg counts, you should be pretty good. And there's a really big reason why this is important. I actually think that climate change is a little bit of a distraction from what the really major issue is at the moment. Biodiversity collapse is a huge worry for me. And whilst wormers are continually used, it's yet something else knocking biodiversity out of whack. I should have dung beetles on my farm, but I don't. I really hope they come back soon because I know that their presence is really huge in the overall ecosystem. And if we fix biodiversity loss, it is going to go a huge way towards mitigating climate change. Well, provided, of course, we actually stop burning fossil fuels. But we have to start utilising natural processes in our farming to move away from synthetic inputs, which reap such destruction on ecology. But of course, herbal leys aren't the only climate mitigation strategies that can be used on farms. So I'm going to do a quick kind of whistle-stop tour through some of my other thoughts. Resilience from a business standpoint is obviously really critical. And I'd argue that risking everything on annual crops or everything on one livestock enterprise is a bit too close to all your eggs in one basket. If you can mitigate cash flow peaks and troughs year on year, that can only help massively, especially with 2 wet winters on the trot. Now, for harvest 2020, I was on corn cart, and with arable yields down sort of 20 or 30%, I wasn't in very much of a rush. So I turned the tractor off one day on the drive back across the farm and sat by this very hedgerow. And it was absolutely busting to the brim full of fruit. So the arable was down and perennial hedge fruit was up. If only there was some way to monetize that. And of course there is. Now I'm just waiting on my willows to complete the first 50 acres of agroforestry. This is planted into a newly established herbal ley. This is actually to fix a plethora of annual farming mistakes that I've made over the past 4 or 5 years. And there's a massive variety of trees here, some of which will actually benefit from climate change. So peach, apricot, nectarine, almond. So much as I do want to mitigate climate change, there's nothing wrong with planning for it too. And of course, at the moment, these trees are tiny, but the massive benefit here is going to come in sort of 10 to 15 years time when I get the silver pasture benefits of these belts running up the field. It's going to be really amazing. And then the final really important addition that I'm working on is adding water to the system. I need to be able to spread those winter deluges out over the dry summers. So reservoirs are going to be critical. Now, I'm sure also that those more exotic fruits that I spoke about, much as they'll be happy with the warmer temperatures, they're still going to want a drink. And I hope also that by having this permanent water supply, I'm also going to enable some market gardening on the farm. Now, this picture is a pond that my father built in 1990 when draining and flattening some marshland. We're not going to be doing that again. But I had a little bit of a water epiphany just at this spot past summer, watching dragonflies doing battle and mating, which was something which is really quite surprisingly noisy and impossible to take a picture of. And water is such an amazing, fantastic addition for biodiversity. And this is the important point. I am feverishly restructuring my farm with diversity as the core principle, based around creating an amazing nature habitat, which provides a wealth of nutritious food and fiber. Anyway, that's been me. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Wow. You managed to like knock off a whole heap of my Fab Farmers practices there with agroforestry and mixed cropping and herbal leys. Yeah, all over it. Thank you. There was some questions again about mixes and things. If you don't mind, we'll move on to John and then we'll come back and have a bit of a discussion about what people are doing in terms of what species they're growing in a sec, if that's okay. Thank you ever so much. Amazing. Right. So John is he's joining us from New Zealand, and he's been training farmers and in Australia and New Zealand for over 20 years, conducting over 300 educational events and publishing over 150 articles in the media. He works with red meat groups throughout New Zealand, boosting farmer confidence and skills within regenerative and holistic farming practices. And some of the conversations I've already had with him, there's a huge amount we can learn. So I'll pass very quickly over to John, as I fear we are heading on with our time. Thank you very much.
No, thanks for that, Kate. That's fantastic, and thanks for everybody for joining us this evening. It's getting a bit late, but anyway, I just wanted to just say that that I'm also involved with Alan Savory's Holistic Management. I've been working with that for 20 years as well, and I'm affiliated with both the Savory Institute and with Holistic Management International. Before we get started too far, I just wanted to show this slide here, where this is where we're going to go, and because there's plenty of differences between these two photographs, but the real similarity is getting animals behind a single wire. And for you sheep farmers out there, there's 2,000 ewes in that mob there, and I just want you to be thinking about, well, how do we get to that stage where we can hold that big a mob behind a single wire? It's really considered to be impossible here in New Zealand, and that's where we're going to go with this presentation. But really, I mean, as David pointed out before, you know, we're really good at lucerne in New Zealand. Here's the cookbook for that. You can get all your recipes out of that, and it's readily available. There's also some dramas associated with it too. Being a monoculture, of course, it's biologically unstable and it requires a herbicide to maintain it. And a lot of the people I'm working with are trying to get away from herbicides. There's protein energy imbalances, and that leads to a lot of livestock health issues. So that again creates more inputs for the farmer. I don't know if you're aware, but New Zealand, 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. So there's issues around legumes and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as nitrogen leaching. Our rivers here are really important to us, but we've got a lot of water quality issues due to nitrogen. And as this photo really demonstrates, lucerne really as a monoculture opens itself up to problems around erosion and sediment movement. And that's because the leaf itself really doesn't contribute to pasture litter. And that's really made home for me here with Linda Matthews in Waikaria, North Canterbury, a few years back when I visited his property. And this is not too far along after a big rainfall event. And again, these paddocks are only like a few meters apart. But on that right-hand side there, you know, not only do you have the most summer active plant in New Zealand emerging there, which is the lucerne, but you also have the most winter active perennial there as well, and that's prairie grass. And as you can see from there, there's the prairie grass as the base is really preventing any erosion happening. And also it gives you more options because, of course, you can then graze this pasture in the winter. And so, I mean, we're seeing actually New Zealand farmers have actually been doing this mix from at least 1860s, so it's been around for quite a long time. And so we're seeing more farmers, you know, use lucerne in a mix because, of course, it's not the plant, it's its management. And as we have lucerne in mixes, then we change the grazing management and find that these other species also really thrive from that, particularly deep-rooting species. And this is Shane Armstrong's property at Apodicus, what his dairy mixes look like. And as you can imagine, you know, dairy cows milk very well in these kinds of mixes. And we're seeing, you know, a lot of interest in these kinds of annual crops and so on. There's all over New Zealand, and there's a lot of interest there in terms of using it as a primer, which is what George was talking about a minute ago, and also to, you know, get animal performance and so on. And, you know, but there's also an opportunity here to help farmers discover the importance of landscape function and environmental services. And how people can do this is with a chart like this, for example. I mean, these charts are all over the internet at the moment, and what you have across the top there is, you know, the service or the landscape function you want to change or improve or strengthen. And down the side, you've got all the different plants that you could possibly choose from for putting into a mix, and then you just compare them all against one another regarding their ability to deal with these services. And if we were to look at, reducing soil erosion, for example, then what we're finding is that these winter crops that have got cereals in them are really providing an opportunity to lay down a litter bed for the animals to stand on to keep them out of the mud. Because I don't know about the UK, but here in New Zealand, it's becoming socially unacceptable to see animals standing in mud in the winter with winter crop. And so we're starting to see a lot more interest in that. Alan Richardson has done, provided some really excellent examples there of what he's doing in West Otago, and so is Mark Anderson in South Otago as well. We'll get back to Mark in a minute, but there's also risks. Of course, when you're doing this, you're going into that cropping regime, and we've seen some of the risks. George was explaining those a minute or two back, some of the dramas that he's dealing with. So there's issues around germination and establishment. There's also problems with lower yields, particularly if there's low moisture. That's offset to a degree because animals tend to eat less of these crops because of the diversity. And of course, with perennial pastures, species tend to disappear over time. And of course, that's a grazing issue, because grazing is really, is the dominant activity that determines what's actually happening in a paddock. And this is again a classic example that I might come across. For example, this is Josh Bradfield's property in West Otago with a group I took to his place back in February last year, and you can see in the background there where all the farmers are standing that that's where the swede mix was planted, and it was planted at a time when the paddock was too wet, so really only the swedes emerged. But as a facilitator with red meat groups, my job is to help the farmers, see other opportunities. And in the foreground here, you can see this is where the rest of the mix had actually germinated and actually established. And so, the discussion that we would have there is what's the potential for this? If we can make this work, for example, in terms of providing additional feed mid to late summer, because those beans and so on there would provide the protein. You'd already have all the fibre and carbohydrate in the grasses, and most of those are English grasses. Is that could that help you again create a bank of feed going into the autumn and into the winter? So there's those sorts of things that that my job as a facilitator is about highlighting. And other people are doing other things, for example, along these kinds of lines. One of the most successful is Dean Martin in the Hawke's Bay, and he's basically stitching species straight into permanent pasture. And he does this in the autumn or in the late summer when it's really dry, and those plants emerge during that period and become part of the winter grazing regime, as you can see there. And he's also done the sort of the annual cropping thing, and you can see that with the sunflowers there. There's 150 odd rising 1-year-old heifers roaming around in there. So he's been there and done that. But increasingly, what we're seeing is more farmers moving away from those annual crops to working with their pastures. And another innovation that sort of popped up on the radar here too is what's happening here with Mark Anderson is the bale grazing that's come out of the States. And Mark's operating 600-700 dairy cows down in Clinton. And you can see here how he's doing it, and you can see the impact here of these bales on what's probably really relatively high organic matter source. They're probably in the 6 to 8% range. You can see that they're holding the moisture longer, they're growing for longer. And this bottom right photograph here, you can see the light patches in the background. That's where the bales were. See, those plants that are in there are actually remaining vegetative for longer. The dark patches in between are actually where the plants are going to seed. Mark's also working with Siobhan Griffin and looking at a cost comparison with this technique versus annual cropping to renovate pastures. And while the costs are about the same, it's really the opportunity cost that puts bale grazing light years ahead, because of course you could be grazing these pastures right up to when you put the bales into them, and they're going to be ready right away, particularly in the spring, particularly for that troublesome second round where you're looking to sort of extend that round out to help those very first paddocks graze in the first round to get some grass in them. And so whereas with a crop, for example, that paddock could be out for up to 14 months, particularly with fodder beet. But really what's emerging in my groups across New Zealand is that, are these interventions, are they addressing the root cause of the problem? And what I'm seeing emerge is sort of the importance of how do we execute grazing practice? Because if we get that right, then maybe we don't need a lot of these things that are costing us money and time. And this is, classically a classic example is like this. This is Murray Kamak's property in the Waipuka around the Hawke's Bay, and this is right at the height of the drought they had last summer, and right at the middle of our COVID lockdown as well. So you can't destock at that stage. And you can see here the difference between him and his neighbours. And Murray would say, he does the summer cropping thing and all that kind of thing as well. He's a very talented farmer. But what you're seeing there is not just the evidence of one season. That's several seasons that he's been able to create that resilience just through grazing management. And it's not just above the soil that we're seeing that in the soil at his place. And again, this is another classic example showing how the soils have changed. And of course, that's because we know that as you change your grazing and move to a more regenerative style of grazing, then you're pumping more carbon into the soil. And there seems to be a lot of connection between carbon and profitability and resilience with Drought and Deluge. One of the people that's really pushed things along here is Siobhan Griffin, and she runs a business called Next Level Grazing, and she's got 5 steps for success here for farmers that are keen to sort of go down the regenerative grazing path, because of course it's all about management. The particular strength is getting farmers to focus on plant form make grazing decisions, like the 3 or 4 leaf stage, that kind of thing, rather than just biomass. And she's inspiring farmers with other ideas here too, like combining mobs, for example. Some of you in your education journey in this space may have come across Hamish Belsky down in Clinton and South Otago, and he's really been the one that's spearheaded getting grazing to rotational grazing straight out of lambing, and inspiring other farmers. The difference is that, in New Zealand we lamb outside, so these paddocks have had lambing ewes on them, and now we're going to start rotational grazing them. So it's quite a bit different from what I imagine happens a lot in the UK. And we're seeing farmers now put big mobs together straight early in the spring, and they're finding that they're growing a lot more grass, and their animal performance and health is actually improving compared to the traditional seat stocking that we do here. That bottom left-hand photograph, your eyes aren't deceiving you there. There's sheep, cattle, and deer in that particular mob, and Hamish and Twix White at Hawke's Bay there, putting all their animals in one mob for 8 weeks one autumn grew them more grass than any fertilizer regime that they'd done in the past. So this is what's really important about these stock densities and getting pasture to work. You can use hooves, not just mouths, to maintain quality. Remember, for every mouth an animal's taking, it's standing on 4 more. And so you can put that onto the soil surface. That's all going to be fertilizing your land so you don't actually lose it. You can reduce your hay silage area as well, because you'll actually grow more grass doing this, because your hay is often cropped at a lower residual than when you're grazing. So, and another technique to be able to get to do this is, of course, deferred grazing. I mean, there's now a new handbook out of Ag Research led by Dr. Catherine Tozer talking about this. And of course, deferred grazing is when you drop paddocks out in the spring round as you lose quality, and then you bring them back in later, as what's happening in this photograph here. One of the things that Siobhan's really adamant about is getting farmers to do what she calls a recovery plan, and she uses the holistic planned grazing chart to help with that. I don't know about the UK, but in New Zealand, Y chromosome people have a real allergy to paper and planning, and they charge off into the hills every opportunity they get. And the reason for that would be sort of, this is how they see their situation. I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but farmers feel like they're being sort of pointed at quite a bit here. And so the challenge for people like me is, how do we create a sense of adventure and curiosity and fun regarding the practice of grazing? And that's where we come back to that original photograph. This is Rick Cameron's property. He happens to be the partner of Siobhan Griffin. And he's saying, well, if we can get farmers to graze with a single wire, particularly sheep farmers, we're actually addressing a lot of those issues that we're trying to achieve with regenerative farming, and mitigate drought and deluge. And this is some of the things that he suggests would really help farmers move in that direction. Of course, having a recovery plan to keep the farmer disciplined and to develop livestock trust with them. Of course, you've got to keep your animals fully fed, and if you really want to shift move animal performance, you can do multiple shifts a day. And of course, those high residuals is what we get for environmental advantages. And he also suggests too that, if you want to get better, breed your own animals, because form follows function, that kind of thing. He's really adamant that you won't get too far ahead with this unless you value your own time. A lot of people think farm management's about doing more with every hour. It's actually trying to find more time to reflect as you're working. And so that might be, instead of driving across your paddock, you actually walk through your pasture, that kind of thing. Because as Rick points out there, laziness is only any good when carried out properly. Otherwise, the only person that you're cheating is yourself. And so people ask me, how successful is this kind of stuff? And I'm saying, well, it's going to depend on who your friends are, because your successes come from the shoulders of others. And I've been lucky to be involved with the Red Meat Profit Partnership program for the last 2.5 years, which has allowed me to get groups of farmers all over New Zealand to get together and discuss and explore and question and clarify what regenerative practices are available to them. And so it's been a really good opportunity there to create some confidence among farmers to make that happen. So anyway, that's just my contact details if people are interested in chatting with me down the track. Thank you for the opportunity, Kate, to speak about this, and I can just get you to pick up some questions and we can go from there.
Thank you so much, John. And I'm so excited to now have you in our group so that we can sort of have some further discussions, particularly within the Fab Your Farmers project going forward, because I think there's so much that certainly a lot of the farmers I'm working with can learn from you guys. So that's amazing. If I appreciate we've like really short for time, but I'm just gonna bring back everybody, and there's a few questions. But well, John and David, I guess particularly around lucerne in terms of, why you need to grow it as a pure stand or instead of, being able to bring it into mixes, particularly as you have some of these challenges as growing it as a pure stand. David, I know you've been looking at putting it in with Samfoin as well, but it's management, isn't it, usually in terms of having it as a monoculture?
There's a few different problems with it. Basically, it's pretty competitive. There's guys in Canada that are growing it with Samfoin and grasses. Your main problem is you limit the life. It wants to be on its own. It's got an immune toxicity thing. If you grow it as a mix, you basically limit the life of the ley, which is fine. Some of the leys in New Zealand are getting sort of 8-9 years, but so next year we're going to drill Samfoin grass lucerne mix, but with the lucerne and the Samfoin in alternate rows, a sort of 150 mil spacings. Going to see if that helps. Some of the grass problems is that you don't want too much moisture around the crown, then you get fungal problems, and you're just limiting the life of the plant.
Okay, perfect. John, just about mixes on heavy land. A couple of people have been talking about how they've got quite heavy land and we're looking to grow herbal leys mixes and what sorts of species they should grow. Have you got any thoughts on particular?
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, you can get away with you want those deeper rooting plants. And certainly, again, go back to that kind of chart that I put up to explore what might work at your place. And again, a lot of it's going to come back down to how you graze those pastures. It's not so much the plant. I mean, plants give you a good head up, but it's really that grazing and really getting on top of your grazing management that really ensures that because I mean, really the big thing we want is that we want low cost, low risk agriculture. That's where we want to be. Because we want to be profitable. So we don't want to be doing this all the time, because otherwise you've got to lift your income to pay for all these costs. And these are all the hidden costs that are in farming. We're trying to get rid of those because it's, that's what gives you flexibility as a farmer, not just to produce, but also to be profitable. None of these guys are going to be here if the banks are banging on their door trying to get money off them, So that's the big thing is how do we produce low risk profit? Graham Hand talks a lot about this in Australia, and that's what his focus is.
And and having the combinations of putting cattle in with sheep, and you're obviously limiting the clean grazing benefits of being able to rotate different livestock species. Are your farmers finding that's impacting on worm counts and general problems with?
Yeah, I mean, you're only doing that for a short period of time. Most of these things you're just doing for little periods of time. I mean, like 8 weeks, for example, that kind of thing. So it's like, if you're going to shift multiple times a day, you're not going to do that for 12 months of the year, drive your social life out the window, you know what I mean? You'll want to be only doing that for a short period of time. So that's what you're looking at, is that it's asking those two questions. Okay, what do we need in terms of performance from our livestock, but how can we do that multi-tasking thing of helping their landscape at the same time? I know that's not a Y chromosome thing, but that's where we're trying to help people move to, is to develop that muscle. And that's why that chart's really quite useful, because you're going to get livestock performance anyway.
Yeah, sure. So it's just that constant adaptation that you need.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, running about estrogen levels in lucerne. Is it a problem in terms of when you're putting lambs to the tup? Have you had any problems, David?
So you get an estrogen content when you get these little brown fungal spores on the leaves. Other than that, estrogen's not a problem. You get the fungal spores and the plant is stressed generally, I think. So that could be aphids, all sorts of things. We didn't tup any sheep on it. We were resting it. But from what I've read, no, it's not a problem unless you've got fungal spores on the leaves.
Okay, brilliant. George, what species have you got in your mixes? Someone was asking earlier.
So there's loads of grasses. So obviously there are some ryegrasses, but the meadow grasses and timothies and John Coxfoots and things like that. But then a few types of red and white clovers and some sweet clovers in there as well as the annual ones. Burnet, yarrow, and another herb, sheep's parsley. I've got the whole. If someone wants to ask, I can
message you. You can give them a list. Okay, perfect. And just if you establish that as part of your rotation, you're not trying to improve permanent pasture. They're all freshly sown crops. Yeah,
they're very much there for a 4-year period of time, exactly.
Yeah, because that's really exciting, John, what you were saying about people improving permanent pastures and stitching these some of these species in, because it's certainly something that a lot of the UK farmers are finding in the southwest, where they've got permanent pastures that they want to improve, don't want to plough them all up to have to re-sow. So how are they doing that? They're doing that in the autumn, you said.
Well, in the drier parts of the country, that's when they're doing it then. Otherwise, in the more non-brittle parts of the country, you've basically got to go back to either spraying or cultivation. So when the pasture's dormant, that's when you run your direct drill over it as then. So that's the easiest thing to do. Yep. And that's basically what Dean Martin does. Yeah.
Yeah. And someone was just asking in terms of, so dairy farmers adopting these sorts of practices in New Zealand, it's not just beef and sheep.
No, it's not just sheep and beef guys. It's the dairy guys are also looking at this too, because they're seeing incredible benefits as well. Because they run out of grass in January, February, and then you get into that drama of pulling all your feed that you've cropped in the spring, and you're 2 months later you're putting it back in the same paddocks. So again, that's all cost. So how do you get around that? So that's what the guys here are trying to explore: is how do they get their costs down? We don't get subsidised here. We're on the open market right now. Dairy prices are holding, but there's a lot of farmers still aren't making money here, so it's not an easy way of making a living. So yeah.
No, and absolutely, and obviously the direction of travel in the UK regarding the agricultural transition and the fact that we're not getting the support payments going forward, where farmers are going to have to think about how they've got a resilient system plus making good out of the environmental payments that are ahead of them. Sadly, I'm really conscious of time, and that I'll get told off if I keep going on. If people would be keen to talk to David and George and John in a sort of meeting session at another time on the conference, maybe apparently Wednesday might be good. It'll probably be Wednesday evening in order to get John at a relatively reasonable time. If you could just put in the chat if you would be keen to join such a session, then we'll see if we can get something organised. Otherwise, I can just say thank you ever so much. Everyone for joining us, but thank you ever so much to John and David and George for sharing all your experiences. And this evening, it's really amazing to hear the amount of detail that we've managed to cram into these sessions. I just need to thank the technical team and ORFC, and also if you want to know more about Soil Association or innovative farmers or Soil Association certification, book one-to-ones with any staff, any details about fabulous farmers, then do look at the virtual exhibition space. That's the place to go, and you will find all the details. And we'll look at sharing, if we can share people's presentations or any of the details and things coming out. Obviously, there was loads and loads of sort of name checks and resources in John's presentation that obviously you'll be able to go back to. But yeah, everyone have a lovely rest of evening, what's left of it, and thank you ever so much, and we'll see you again.
Thanks, Kate.